Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to look strictly at the data to completely shift your paradigm on one of the most talked about topics in the world today. We are peeling back the rhetoric and the daily headlines to look at the cold, hard statistical realities of global migration.
Okay, let's just dive right into this massive number out of the gate. Plus 20 billion pounds. This represents the net tax surplus contributed by European immigrants in the UK over a single decade. When I first saw this in the data, it completely reframed my understanding. It shows exactly why everything we think we know about migration, particularly its economic impact, might need a serious second look. So here is our roadmap for today. We'll unpack the global aspiration gap, the reality of unlocking trillions in wealth, the true fiscal impact, geography and crime, the democratic dividend, and finally, what a new global architecture could look like. Let's get into it. All right, Section 1, the global aspiration gap.
Let's start by looking at the sheer scale of where the current system is quite literally breaking. We hear a lot about a crisis, but the data actually shows us a fundamental misalignment between human reality and legal structures. By the end of 2024, a staggering 123 million people are estimated to be forcibly displaced. And, this isn't just your traditional political persecution anymore. We are seeing a massive, massive surge in climate refugees and victims of total economic collapse. I mean, this number has essentially tripled since 2010. We are looking at an unprecedented level of forced pressure on global borders. But forced migration? That's really just one piece of the puzzle. Check this out. On one side, we have this massive global aspiration. About 16% of the world's adult population, that's roughly 900 million people, wish to migrate permanently. But on the flip side, the legal capacity of wealthy nations is incredibly, almost impossibly rigid. In 2023, only 2.7 million asylum requests were processed in the entire OECD. It's literally like a giant hourglass. You've got 900 million aspiring migrants pouring into the top, getting squeezed through this tiny legal bottleneck that can only handle 2.7 million. When that massive global aspiration meets an incredibly rigid legal framework, the whole architecture just collapses into a multi-year legal void. It's a seismic shock between what humans are driven to do and what the system actually allows them to do. Which brings us to Section 2, unlocking trillions in wealth. So, what actually happens to the global economy if we simply remove these structural barriers? Well, the crucial point here is that removing barriers to migration could theoretically increase global GDP by up to 50% in the long run. 50%! Economists literally refer to this as leaving trillions of dollars on the sidewalk. When people are allowed to move to where their labor is most productive, the entire globe just gets wealthier. Now, what's really fascinating is exactly why that wealth is created. It's not just about a person's individual skills. Human productivity is heavily dictated by the institutional environment they move into. When someone moves to a country with stronger infrastructure and institutions, their output absolutely skyrockets. And importantly, this benefits poorer regions too. The data proves that removing these barriers sends wealth flowing right back home, boosting long-term income in places like sub-Saharan Africa by up to 40%. Moving right along to Section 3, the real economic impact. Okay, so we've looked at the global theory, but what happens to the local tax base? Contrary to a lot of the dominant political rhetoric you might hear on the news, the fiscal analysis paints a surprisingly clear, positive picture. Just looking at data from the UK between 2001 and 2011, immigrants from the European Economic Area generated a massive net positive tax contribution of 20 billion pounds. And even non-EEA immigrants generated a net positive contribution of about 5 billion pounds. They paid significantly more into the system in taxes than they ever took out in public services or benefits. I really want to emphasize this point because the data tells a deeply surprising story. In proportion to their population, all immigrant groups systematically contributed more to the public purse than native-born citizens. That completely flips the traditional narrative on its head, right? Economically speaking, migration is a net subsidy to the host nation. It actively lowers the tax burden on native citizens rather than raising it. When you look at vibrant financial hubs, like London, for example, it becomes undeniably clear from the fiscal data. Well-managed immigration isn't a drain at all. It is a massive economic engine that funds public services and drives serious growth. All right, Section 4, Geography, Crime, and Status. Now, to be completely impartial here, while the national economic impact is overwhelmingly positive, we do have to recognize the localized geographical realities this movement creates. Migrants naturally tend to concentrate heavily in very specific urban areas, and that creates a localized friction. To prevent overburdening local health and housing services in those specific zones, governments need to strategically direct funding to support that infrastructure. The wealth is definitely there nationally, but it must be applied locally.
And then, of course, there is the intense rhetoric around crime. But check out this data from Italy. It fundamentally shifts the entire conversation. When we look at high incarceration rates among immigrants, the data shows it is almost exclusively linked to a legal status, not the immigrants themselves. When asylum seekers are banned from working by deterrence policies, they are pushed into survival crime. But get this, when the EU expanded in 2007 and instantly granted legal status to many immigrants in Italy, there was an immediate 50% drop in the recidivism rate. 50%! So what this tells us is that policies of deterrence that deliberately ban people from working are actively fueling the very crises they claim to prevent. Legalization, on the other hand, is completely transformative. It allows people to participate legally in the economy, fundamentally solving the issue of survival-driven crime. Let's pivot to Section 5, the democratic dividend. Let's zoom back out for a second and look at this fascinating cultural ripple effect. We often think of immigration purely as a labor flow, but it's actually a really powerful vector of soft power. And the sources break it down into 3 measurable steps. Step 1 is exposure. Migrants live daily within democratic norms and institutions in their host countries. Step 2 is transmission. They share these civic values and expectations back home through family networks, visits, and digital communication. And finally, step 3 is transformation. This steady flow of ideas progressively modifies the political ecosystem and civic demands in the origin country. Just think about the technological and cultural bridge this creates. You have someone sitting at a cafe in Europe, seamlessly connected to their origin country via their smartphone. It proves that democratic values aren't just contained within borders. They're actively exported globally through the very people who migrate, acting as a massive catalyst for democratic institutional influence worldwide. Finally, Section 6, a new global architecture. So, based on all these statistical realities, how do we actually fix this broken paradigm? Well, the sources suggest replacing our current reactive walls with 3 proactive pillars. First, we must recognize complexity. The 1951 legal framework was built for political persecution. It creates a massive ethical dilemma today when we are faced with millions of climate refugees and victims of systemic state collapse who simply don't fit that rigid definition. Second, we have to move past the dead end of deterrence. Pushing borders outward often violates international law and actually fuels the crisis. And third, we need to embrace the dividends. Well-managed immigration is an undeniable fiscal engine and a massive transfer of human capital. The movement of populations is just an inevitable feature of our deeply interconnected world. It brings massive human capital together and blends rich cultures, creating an incredible synthesis of skills and backgrounds. It is not simply the fruit of desperation. It is a resource-intensive endeavor that actively reshapes our global future. So I'll leave you with this provocative question to ponder. Faced with trillions in untapped economic potential, verifiable net positive tax contributions, and deep democratic dividends that span the globe, what kind of system will our generation choose to build? Will we stay trapped behind reactive walls, or will we finally design an intelligent global architecture? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. See you next time.